An old man stumbles along the shoulder of a highway. No coat, one eye swollen shut, his hands shaking from cold, and something worse than cold. A motorcycle slows beside him. He doesn't ask for help. He can't find the words, except three of them. "He's hurting me." The biker doesn't hesitate. He doesn't know yet that this moment will pull nearly 700 strangers onto a highway 2 weeks from now, engines idling outside a courthouse, waiting to find out if an old man's plea was enough to save him, or if it came too late. Right now, he only knows one thing. This man is terrified to go home, and somebody, finally, is listening. George Whitaker had lived on Persimmon Street for 41 years, long enough to watch the maple trees his late wife planted grow taller than the roofline, long enough to know which floorboard creaked outside the bathroom and which neighbor's dog barked at exactly 6 every morning. At 78, he moved through his own home the way a man moves through a museum of his life, carefully, reverently, and increasingly like a stranger. The house smelled of instant coffee and Bengay. A calendar from the Roanoke Valley SPCA hung crooked on the kitchen wall, its pages 3 months behind. George had once been a foreman at the old textile mill off 9th Street, a man who could read a ledger faster than any accountant and who never let a debt go unpaid. His hands, now spotted and stiff with arthritis, still remembered the weight of a wrench, the particular give of a bolt loosening under the right pressure. But those hands trembled now when he poured his coffee, and some mornings he didn't trust them to hold the cup at all. His wife, Dorothy, had passed 6 years earlier, an aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon while she was watering her tomato plants. George still kept her gardening gloves by the back door. He hadn't touched the garden since. It was Dorothy who used to say that family was the only investment that never depreciated. George believed that once. He believed it the day his grandson, Dylan Pierce, showed up on his porch 2 years ago with a duffel bag and a story about a landlord who'd thrown him out over a misunderstanding. Dylan was 31 then, George's daughter's boy, though George's daughter had died of a drug overdose when Dylan was 19. And George had raised him for a stretch of his teenage years before Dylan drifted off into a life George never fully understood. One of odd jobs, longer gaps between phone calls, and an unmistakable hardness that had crept into his voice. "Just till I get back on my feet, Grandpa," Dylan had said, and George, lonely in a house too big and too quiet, had opened the door without hesitation. For the first few months, it had almost been good. Dylan fixed the gutter. He drove George to his cardiology appointments in Salem. He laughed at George's old stories about the mill, about the union strikes of 78, about the time George had talked a foreman out of firing half the night shift. George had let himself believe that something broken in his family might finally be mending. Then the bills started disappearing from the counter before George could look at them. Then Dylan started helping George manage his pension checks, first with a shrug. "It's easier if it just goes into my account, Grandpa. Less paperwork for you." And then with an insistence that left no room for argument. George's old friend Walter Combs, who used to come by on Thursdays to play checkers, stopped being invited in. "He tires you out," Dylan said. "You need rest, not company." George told himself it was fine. He told himself Dylan meant well, that the boy had been through so much, that this was what family did. You gave people grace, especially the ones who'd lost their mother too young. He told himself these things right up until the night 4 months ago when he'd asked gently whether he might see his bank statement, and Dylan had turned from the sink with a look George had never seen on his own kin. Something flat and cold, something that made the hair on George's arms rise. "You think I'm stealing from you?" Dylan had said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't say that," George had answered, already backing down, already smoothing it over the way he'd learned to do. "You didn't have to." That was the first night Dylan grabbed his arm hard enough to leave a mark. George had worn long sleeves for a week after, even in the September heat, telling himself it was nothing, that Dylan had just been upset, that men in grief did things they regretted. It was not the last time. By the following spring, George had learned the rhythms of the house, the way a man learns to read weather before a storm, the particular silence that meant Dylan had been drinking, the sound of the truck door slamming too hard, the way Dylan's footsteps on the porch could tell George, before the door even opened, what kind of evening it was going to be. George stopped answering the phone when it rang, because Dylan didn't like him talking to people. He stopped going to church, because Dylan said the drive wasn't worth it for an old man who dozed through the sermon anyway. His world had shrunk to the size of this house, this kitchen, this careful, constant calculation of how to keep the peace. That Tuesday morning in early October, George stood at the bathroom mirror and studied the bruise blooming purple and yellow beneath his left eye. He touched it gingerly, the way you'd touch a stove to check if it was still hot. Dylan had hit him the night before over $20. $20 George had tried to keep back to buy flowers for Dorothy's grave on the anniversary of her passing. Dylan was asleep now, sleeping off whatever he'd been drinking, and the house was silent in the particular way it got after a bad night. Not peaceful, just exhausted. George looked at his reflection for a long moment. He thought of Dorothy, of the mill, of the man he used to be, the one who never let anyone push him around, not once in 50 years. He thought about how small he had become in his own home, in his own skin. Then, moving slower than he wanted to, but faster than he had in months, George Whitaker pulled on his jacket, slipped out the back door past Dorothy's untouched garden gloves, and began walking. Past the mailbox, past the end of Persimmon Street, out toward Route 220, where the morning traffic was just beginning to hum along the two-lane highway that cut through the pines outside Roanoke. He didn't have a plan. He only knew he could not spend one more day inside that house. Kenneth Marsh had ridden Route 220 nearly every Tuesday morning for 6 years, ever since he'd retired from 22 years with the Roanoke City Fire Department and needed somewhere to put the restlessness that retirement hadn't cured. At 59, he still had the build of a man who'd spent decades hauling hose lines and pulling people out of burning buildings, broad through the shoulders, a little heavier through the middle than he liked, silver stubble on a jaw that had been broken twice and never quite sat straight again. He rode a 2019 Harley-Davidson Road King, matte black, with a small American flag decal on the saddlebag that had been there so long it had faded to the color of an old bruise. Kenneth was the president of the Blue Ridge Riders, a motorcycle club that had started 20 years back as a handful of firefighters and veterans who liked to ride together on weekends, and had grown into something bigger, a network of nearly 800 members across southwestern Virginia who showed up for charity runs, for funerals of fallen soldiers, for kids' hospital visits where grown men in leather vests handed out toy motorcycles to children hooked up to IV poles. Kenneth had learned in his years with the fire department to notice things other people missed, a particular color of smoke, the way a building's silence could mean something was about to give. That instinct hadn't left him just because he'd traded his turnout gear for a riding jacket. Which was why, that Tuesday morning, doing 55 along the tree-lined stretch of 220 just past the Cave Spring exit, Kenneth noticed the old man on the shoulder of the road before his conscious mind had even finished processing what he was looking at. The man was walking unsteadily, no coat despite the October chill settling in his bones, moving with the particular gait of someone whose legs weren't entirely reliable, but whose will was pushing them forward anyway. As Kenneth's bike drew closer, the man turned, and for a half-second their eyes met. Kenneth eased off the throttle before he'd consciously decided to stop. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder a few dozen yards past the man and killed the engine, swinging his leg over the seat as the old man closed the distance between them, at a pace that seemed to cost him everything he had. Up close, Kenneth could see the bruising along the man's left cheekbone, dark and unmistakable, the kind of mark that didn't come from a fall. The man's eyes were pale blue, wet at the edges, and they fixed on Kenneth with an intensity that made the fine hair on Kenneth's arms stand up beneath his jacket. "Sir, you all right?" Kenneth asked, already reaching for his phone, already running through the mental checklist of a man who'd spent 2 decades responding to emergencies. "You need me to call somebody? An ambulance?" The old man's mouth worked for a moment, as if the words had to travel a long way to reach his lips. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold, Kenneth realized, but from something deeper, something that had been shaking loose inside him for a long time. "He's hurting me." 3 words. Kenneth would remember them for the rest of his life, not because they were dramatic or eloquent, but because of the plainness of them. The terrible, matter-of-fact weight behind each syllable, the way the old man said them like he'd been carrying them so long he'd forgotten how to say anything else. "Who's hurting you?" Kenneth asked, keeping his voice level, the same tone he used to use talking down a victim in shock. "Sir, what's your name?" "George," the old man said. "George Whitaker." "My grandson. He's—" George's voice cracked, and his knees seemed to give slightly before Kenneth caught his elbow, steadying him. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm out here. I couldn't be in that house one more—" "Don't apologize," Kenneth said. "You're not in any trouble. You're safe right now, all right? You're safe." He guided George to a low guardrail a few feet off the shoulder and helped him sit, then crouched in front of him, taking in the details with the clinical eye of a man who'd seen abuse before, in kitchens and living rooms across the county, and had learned to recognize its fingerprints. The bruise on George's cheek was maybe a day old. There was a fainter yellowing mark along his jaw that looked older still. George's wrist, when Kenneth gently checked it, bore the ghost of finger-shaped bruising. "How long has this been happening, George?" George's eyes dropped to his hands. "Months. Maybe longer. I didn't want to believe it was as bad as it was. He's my grandson. His mother, my daughter, she died when he was young, and I thought if I just gave him time—" "You don't have to explain that part to me," Kenneth said gently. "None of that's on you." He called it in. Not 911, not yet, not with George shaking like a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't take back. Instead, Kenneth called Marisol Reyes, a social worker with Adult Protective Services who'd spoken at a Blue Ridge Riders charity event the previous spring and had given Kenneth her direct line, half joking that bikers probably saw more of the county than caseworkers did. Marisol answered on the second ring, and Kenneth explained the situation in the clipped, precise language of a man used to giving reports at a scene. "Can you get him somewhere safe today?" Marisol asked. "Not home, somewhere I can meet you both within the hour." "I can do that," Kenneth said, glancing at George, who was watching him with an expression Kenneth couldn't quite name, something between terror and the first flicker of hope a drowning man feels when a hand closes around his wrist. Kenneth didn't have a second helmet in his saddlebag that morning, which was, in hindsight, the only piece of luck in an otherwise grim morning, because it meant Kenneth called his clubmate, Timothy Doss, who lived 4 minutes away and owned the only pickup truck among their close riding circle that had 4 working seatbelts. While they waited, George told him more, haltingly, the words coming easier now that they'd found their first opening. He talked about the pension checks, about Walter Combs no longer being welcome, about the small, cumulative cruelties that had worn him down like water over stone. He talked about Dorothy, and how he sometimes thought she'd have known what to do, would have marched into that house and put a stop to it in an afternoon, the way she'd put a stop to everything unfair in 51 years of marriage. "She'd have been ashamed of me," George said quietly, "letting it get this far." "No," Kenneth said, and there was iron in his voice now, the voice he used to use standing at the edge of a fire, ordering younger men back. "She'd be proud you walked out that door this morning. That took more courage than most people ever have to find." Timothy's truck pulled up 10 minutes later, As George was helped into the passenger seat, wincing at the effort, Kenneth stood by the guardrail for a moment, looking back down the empty stretch of highway George had walked, alone, with nothing but 3 words, and whatever was left of his will. Kenneth didn't know yet how deep this went, how tangled the finances were, how far Dylan Pierce would go to keep his grip on the old man, and the pension checks that funded whatever life he was living. He didn't know, standing there in the cold October morning, that within 2 weeks he would be standing in front of nearly the entire membership of the Blue Ridge Riders, asking them to show up for a man none of them had ever met. He only knew that some things, once you saw them, you couldn't unsee. And George Whitaker's face, the fear in it, and beneath the fear, the exhausted, stubborn flicker of a man who still believed he deserved better, was not something Kenneth Marsh was going to forget. He climbed onto his bike and followed the truck toward Marisol Reyes's office, already turning over in his mind who he needed to call. The meeting with Marisol Reyes lasted 90 minutes and left George feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like someone was finally listening. Marisol was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, and she took notes without ever once making George feel like a case number instead of a man. She photographed his bruises. She asked careful questions about the pension checks, about power of attorney, about whether Dylan had ever taken him to sign any documents George didn't fully understand. That last question made something cold settle in George's stomach. 6 weeks earlier, Dylan had driven him to a notary's office in a strip mall off Brambleton Avenue, had guided George's hand through several signatures with a patience George had mistaken at the time for kindness. George couldn't remember now exactly what those papers had said. "I'll pull the county records," Marisol told him. "In the meantime, George, I want to be honest with you about how this works. I can open a formal investigation today. I can request a welfare check, but an investigation takes time, and unless we have grounds for immediate removal, which we may, given what I'm seeing, you may need to go back to that house tonight while this moves through the system." George felt the floor of his small, fragile courage give way beneath him. "Go back," he repeated. "I know that's hard to hear," Marisol said. "There's an emergency shelter option, but it's 40 minutes away, shared housing, and honestly, George, at your age, with your mobility, I want to find you something better than that if I can. Give me 48 hours. I can move fast on an emergency protective order if you're willing to file. That would legally bar Dylan from the house and give you real protection, not just a promise." Kenneth, who'd stayed through the whole meeting, though nobody had asked him to, spoke up from the corner of the small office. "What if he's not alone when he goes back?" Marisol looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not walking through that door by himself tonight, and he's not going to be alone tomorrow, or the day after, until this is settled." Kenneth's jaw was set in a way George was beginning to recognize, the look of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply informing the room. "I've got people. I can have someone with him around the clock if that's what it takes." Marisol studied him for a long moment, weighing something George couldn't read. "That's not standard protocol," she said finally. "But it's not against it either, as long as George is comfortable with it, and as long as nobody does anything that gives Dylan Pierce's lawyer an excuse to say he was harassed or intimidated. This has to be by the book, Mr. Marsh. A protective order, filed properly, executed properly, not vigilante justice." "Understood," Kenneth said. "We're not looking for trouble. We're looking to make sure an old man isn't alone in a house with someone who's been putting his hands on him." George, listening to the two of them negotiate his safety like it was a piece of infrastructure to be built, felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something closer to disbelief. He had grown so used to being invisible in his own life that the sensation of people fighting for him, planning for him, felt almost physically strange, like blood returning to a limb that had gone numb. That evening, Dylan came home to find George sitting in the living room with Timothy Doss, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a grey-flecked beard and a Blue Ridge Rider's vest, sitting across from him, drinking coffee like he'd been invited for Sunday supper. The confrontation that followed was ugly. Dylan's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, then calculation, then a fury he tried badly to mask as concern. "Who the hell is this?" Dylan demanded, looking between George and Timothy. "A friend," George said, and his voice, though it trembled, did not break. "Grandpa, can I talk to you? Alone?" Dylan's eyes cut toward Timothy with unmistakable hostility. "No," George said. It was the first time in 2 years he had told his grandson no, and the word sat strange and heavy in his mouth, like a language he was only just relearning. "I spoke to Adult Protective Services today, Dylan. I told them what's been happening." The color drained from Dylan's face, and for a moment George braced for violence. Flinched, actually, an old reflex his body hadn't unlearned. But Timothy shifted forward in his chair just slightly, just enough to remind everyone in the room that George was not alone tonight, and Dylan's hands, which had curled into fists, slowly loosened. "You don't know what you're doing," Dylan said, low and venomous. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," George said, "but I regret the last 2 years more." Dylan left that night and didn't come back for 3 days. 3 days during which members of the Blue Ridge Riders rotated through George's house in shifts. Timothy, then a soft-spoken veteran named Kenneth's crew called Ray Boone, then a woman named Patricia Ellery, who'd lost her own father to a similar situation years before, and who sat with George at his kitchen table and taught him patiently how to check his bank balance on his phone. George cried more in those 3 days than he had in the 6 years since Dorothy died. Grief, relief, shame, and something that was slowly, cautiously becoming hope, all tangled together. But on the 4th day, everything nearly fell apart. Dylan came back, not to the house, but to the courthouse on the morning of the emergency protective order hearing, with a lawyer George hadn't known he could afford, and a story delivered with wounded, convincing sincerity about an elderly man in cognitive decline being manipulated by a motorcycle gang that had descended on his family and turned him against the grandson who'd sacrificed his own life to care for him. Sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting for the hearing to begin, George felt the old fear rise up in him like floodwater. He looked at the papers in his lap, at the photographs of his own bruised face that Marisol had printed for the file, and for one terrible, dizzying moment, he considered withdrawing the petition, considered telling the judge it had all been a misunderstanding, considered going back to the quiet house on Persimmon Street and simply enduring the way he'd endured for 2 years, because enduring at least was familiar, and this fight, this courtroom, this exposure was not. Kenneth, sitting beside him in the hallway, seemed to sense the shift. He didn't say anything grand. He just leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said quietly, "You don't have to be brave today, George. You already were on that highway. Today, you just have to tell the truth. Let us handle the rest." George looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked down the hallway, toward the courtroom doors, and thought of Dorothy's gardening gloves still hanging by the back door, waiting for someone who might someday use them again. "All right," George said, and stood. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Thursday in late October, in a courthouse that suddenly felt, to George, impossibly large and cold. Judge Renata Colley presided, a woman known around the Roanoke Valley Courthouse for her exacting patience with elder abuse cases, having handled a string of them over her 15 years on the bench. Dylan's lawyer, a sharp young man named Bradley Sutton, opened with the narrative Kenneth had warned George to expect: confusion, undue influence, an elderly man manipulated by a biker organization with no legal standing in this family's affairs. He painted Dylan as a devoted grandson, driven to desperation by watching his grandfather's health decline, who had made mistakes but never, he insisted, out of malice. George sat rigid in the gallery, hands clasped so tightly in his lap his knuckles had gone white, and felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink, to smooth things over, to let the more forceful voice in the room win. It was Marisol Reyes who steadied him. A brief, firm look across the aisle that said, without words, "Hold on." What none of them, not Dylan, not his lawyer, not even Judge Colley, fully anticipated was what waited outside. Word had travelled through the Blue Ridge Riders network in the way word travels through any tight community, fast and with purpose. Kenneth had made calls. Timothy had made calls. Patricia had posted in 3 regional riding forums a simple message: "An elder in our valley needs us." Hearing Thursday, 10 a.m., Roanoke County Courthouse. No confrontation, no trouble. Just show up. Let him see he's not alone. What started as a request among the Blue Ridge Riders' 800 members spread within 4 days to clubs across 3 counties: the Shenandoah Valley Vets, the Star City Riders, a chapter of Bikers Against Child Abuse, whose members had, over the years, developed similar instincts for protecting the vulnerable, regardless of age. Nobody organized it exactly. It simply grew, the way grassroots things do, each rider telling 2 more, each message forwarded a dozen times. By 9:40 that morning, the parking lot and surrounding streets around the Roanoke County Courthouse were filled with motorcycles, rows of them, chrome catching the pale autumn sun, engines cooling in the crisp air after long rides in from Lynchburg, from Blacksburg, from towns George had never even visited. Riders stood in respectful silence along the courthouse steps and sidewalk, leather vests bearing patches from a dozen different clubs, veterans standing beside retirees, standing beside young mechanics who'd taken the morning off work. Nearly 700 of them, by the county sheriff's later estimate, not shouting, not blocking entrances, simply present, a wall of quiet solidarity that stretched down the block. When George arrived that morning in Kenneth's truck, he had not known what to expect. What he saw through the windshield stole the breath from his lungs. "Kenneth," George said, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "This," Kenneth said, "is what happens when you tell the truth to the right people, George." George stepped out of the truck on unsteady legs, and the riders nearest him, strangers, every one of them, straightened, and a few removed their helmets, and one older woman near the front, grey-haired beneath a faded American flag bandana, simply said, "Morning, sir," with a gentleness that undid something in George's chest he'd been holding tight for 2 years. He walked into that courthouse flanked not by fear, but by 700 people who had never met him and had come anyway. Inside, the effect was not lost on the courtroom. Judge Colley, glancing toward the window that overlooked the crowded street below, allowed herself the smallest, most human pause before returning to the proceedings. Dylan, seated beside his lawyer, had gone pale, his earlier composure fracturing at the edges. He had come prepared to paint himself as the victim of an overreaching stranger's interference. He had not prepared for the sight of an entire community standing at his grandfather's back. Marisol Reyes testified next, presenting the documentation her investigation had turned up in the intervening days. Bank records showing George's pension direct deposited into an account Dylan controlled, withdrawals for cash advances George had never authorized, the notarized power of attorney document from the strip mall office, which, upon closer review, granted Dylan far broader financial authority than George had understood he was signing. A neighbor, Walter Combs, the friend Dylan had cut off from George over a year earlier, took the stand and described, haltingly, the gradual isolation he'd watched happen from a distance, his own failed attempts to check in, the way George had stopped answering his door. Then George testified. He had not planned to speak long. He had practiced the night before, sitting at his kitchen table with Patricia Ellery, a short statement about the bruises, about the fear, about the $20 for Dorothy's flowers. but sitting in the witness chair, looking out at Dylan's face. A face that still, somewhere beneath the hardness, held traces of the boy George had once taught to fish at Carvin's Cove. George found himself saying more than he'd planned. He talked about raising Dylan after his daughter died, about the promise he'd made at her graveside to look after her boy. He talked about how badly he'd wanted that promise to still mean something, even as the bruises accumulated, even as the isolation deepened, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that promise had, in some terrible way, gone wrong. He talked about Dorothy and the garden and the 3 words he'd said on a stretch of highway to a stranger on a motorcycle because he had run out of every other option he could think of. "I'm not looking for revenge," George said finally, his voice steadier than it had been in the whole 2 years prior. "I'm not even looking to see him punished, not really. I just want to be safe in my own home. I want to sit at my own kitchen table without wondering what kind of night it's going to be. That's all I ever wanted." The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even Bradley Sutton, Dylan's lawyer, seemed to have lost some of the conviction with which he'd opened the hearing. Judge Colley granted the emergency protective order that afternoon, barring Dylan Pierce from the Persimmon Street property and freezing the accounts under his control, pending a full financial investigation. As the ruling was read, George felt something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like unclenched. Not triumph exactly, not yet, but the first thin edge of safety. Outside, when George emerged from the courthouse, the 700 riders were still there, patient, waiting in the October chill for news. None of them had been guaranteed. When Kenneth stepped out beside George and gave a small private nod, a ripple of quiet relief moved through the crowd. Not cheering, not spectacle, just the low murmur of people who had shown up for someone they'd never met and were glad simply that it had mattered. George stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over a sea of strangers who had become, in the space of 2 weeks, something closer to family than he'd known in years. And for the first time since Dorothy's funeral, he allowed himself to cry openly, without shame, in front of anyone who cared to see. The financial investigation into Dylan Pierce took another 4 months to resolve. In the end, he was charged with financial exploitation of an elder and 2 counts of misdemeanor assault, the felony exploitation charge carrying the heavier weight in Judge Colley's courtroom when the case concluded the following March. He accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, a fraction of what had actually been taken, George knew, but enough. Combined with his modest pension and some careful budgeting Patricia Ellery helped him set up, to keep the house on Persimmon Street and put a little aside besides. Dylan received probation, a restraining order extending 5 years, and, George suspected, very little real reckoning with what he'd done. George had made peace, slowly, with the fact that some debts never get repaid in full. He'd spent enough years balancing ledgers at the mill to understand that some accounts simply close at a loss, and the only choice left is whether to let that loss define everything that comes after. He chose not to let it. In the months following the hearing, George's house began, gradually, to fill again, not with fear this time, but with the ordinary restorative noise of a life reopening. Walter Combs returned to his Thursday checkers games, and the 2 old friends spent long afternoons arguing amiably over the board while a pot of coffee went cold between them. Marisol Reyes checked in monthly at first, then quarterly, her visits growing shorter as her worry grew smaller. Patricia Ellery, who'd sat with George through some of his darkest days, became a regular fixture, teaching him not just how to check his bank balance but how to set up automatic bill pay, how to spot the kind of scam calls that preyed on men his age, patiently rebuilding in him a confidence he'd thought was gone for good. And Kenneth became something George hadn't expected to find again at 78, a friend who showed up without needing to be asked. Every Tuesday morning without fail, Kenneth rode out to Persimmon Street on the Road King, and the two men would sit on George's front porch. George in the same wicker chair he'd occupied for 2 decades, Kenneth perched on the porch railing, drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular. The weather, the Roanoke Valley SPCA calendar George finally updated, the ongoing feud George and Walter maintained over a checkers match from 1994, neither of them would let go. Sometimes other members of the Blue Ridge Riders stopped by too. Timothy, gruff and kind in equal measure, or Patricia, or Ray Boone, who'd developed an unexpected fondness for George's stories about the mill strikes. In April, on the anniversary of Dorothy's passing, Kenneth showed up on a Tuesday, not with his usual coffee thermos, but with a small paper bag from the florist on Brambleton Avenue. "Thought you might want to finally take that walk," Kenneth said. George looked at him for a long moment, then down at Dorothy's gardening gloves, which he'd finally moved from their hook by the back door to the small table beside his wicker chair, where he could see them every morning. They drove together to the cemetery, and George laid daisies, Dorothy's favorite, at the base of her headstone, and stood for a long while in the April sun with a steadiness in his legs and his spirit that he hadn't felt in over 2 years. He thought about the promise he'd made her all those years ago, and the promise he'd made at his daughter's graveside about Dylan, and understood, standing there, that love did not always mean endurance. Sometimes it meant knowing when enduring had become its own kind of harm, to yourself, and in its way, to the people who loved you and could no longer bear to watch. "I think you'd have liked him," George said quietly, meaning Kenneth, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Dorothy or simply to the quiet April air. "He's stubborn. Reminds me a little of you." That summer, George became something of an honorary member of the Blue Ridge Riders, not a rider himself, his knees having long since made that impossible, but a presence at their charity. Events, sitting in a folding chair near the registration table at their annual ride for the Children's Hospital, greeting members he now knew by name, telling anyone who asked the story of the morning he'd walked out onto Route 220 with nothing but 3 words and a bruised face, and found waiting for him on the shoulder of that highway the beginning of everything that came after. He started tending Dorothy's garden again that June. His hands, though still unsteady, remembered more than he expected, the particular care of loosening soil around a tomato stem, the rhythm of watering at dusk when the sun's heat had eased. Walter Combs teased him about the crooked rows. George didn't mind. Crooked rows still grew tomatoes, he'd learned, same as anything else. What mattered wasn't perfection, but the tending. On the 1-year anniversary of the morning he'd flagged down a stranger on Route 220, George Whitaker stood on his porch as the sun set behind the maples Dorothy had planted, watching Kenneth's headlight approach up Persimmon Street for their Tuesday visit, and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember entirely and unshakably at home. The mill was gone now, torn down years ago for a shopping centre George never visited. The union strikes of '78 existed only in stories he told to riders half his age. Dorothy's gardening gloves had finally been put to use again, and somewhere out on the highway, 700 engines had answered a call from an old man who'd believed, right up until the moment he didn't, that he had nowhere left to turn, and had learned, instead, exactly how far strangers would ride for the sake of a single quiet cry for help.